Seeing as I was still out of work, I picked a flight in the middle of the day, leaving at 2:45 out of San Jose Airport via Alaska Air. I packed all my stuff, and since I was just going out for PAX, I packed light, just taking my LTT backpack with enough clothes and my toys. At about 11:45, I took an Uber over to the airport. My driver was Tommy, in a nice black Tesla Model 3, so it was a pleasant and smooth ride over. He told me he was a retired salesperson who now did Uber on the side and he really enjoyed it. When approaching the airport, we saw a few business people crossing there from the hotels, and he said he was happy that he didn't have to wear a suit anymore. We listened to classic rock, and then he dropped me at the airport. Given it was a Labor Day weekend, the airport was pretty busy. I headed straight to security, where rather than the usual need to remove everything electronic and or liquid from my bags, they just had them go through as is. I just had to remove my pocket stuff, belt and shoes, and then get hard object scanned. It seemed this strategy was not paying off in terms of efficiency, as there was a significant delay while they puzzled over the x-ray of each bag and then had to pull people aside to rifle through their things. I was lucky enough not to get selected, so I got my bag and was off into the terminal. I looked at food, but nothing really appealed and there was quite a wait for anything, so I didn't bother. Given I'm arriving fairly early, I can get something in Seattle. At around 2, they began the process of boarding. It was a 100% full flight and they wanted people to check their roller bags at the gate. I was in the second to last boarding group and hadn't gotten any of the premium seats, so I was a little worried that I would have nowhere to put my bag. I thought about checking it, but given it was my only bag and had a bunch of electronics in it, it wasn't really practical. I figured if worst came to the worst, I could probably get the thing under the seat in front. As it turned out, I didn't have any trouble getting my bag in, and I sat in my aisle seat and settled in for the flight. We were told we had to wait for some maintenance sign-off on a rubber seal somewhere in the plane, and this took a few minutes, but after that we were off from the gate. We didn't get very far before they told us Seattle was throttling inbound flights, and we had to wait for a slot, which delayed us another few minutes, with the flight taking off at 3:20. It was a standard flight, not too bumpy, not much to write home about. The woman next to me was playing some sort of match 3 game on a very large tablet and kept elbowing me in the side. I just ignored that and we were soon in Seattle, landing at about 5:04. On the way off the plane, there was a woman talking animatedly on a phone about how she had tried to book a connecting flight using the Alaska free Wi-Fi. That only lets you use their site and not the internet as a whole. It's like an extra $8 for that privilege. But it kept failing, so she booked the wrong flight and then she couldn't cancel and then got charged a wrong fee. And then her husband had to rebook, but he was an idiot and the agent didn't refund the money. This all while trying to get off the plane ahead of everyone else, which never works. Seattle Airport was absolutely packed, much worse than SJC had been. We were also in a part of the airport I'm not sure I've ever been to before, and I had to ride a small subway to get back to the main ground transportation area. They were doing some refurbishment at the airport, so the path to the light rail was a little hidden. But I got there eventually, just missing the train and having to wait 15 minutes for the next, which was pretty crowded. I rode over to downtown Seattle, getting off at Westlake, and then heading over to my hotel, the Grand Hyatt, which is one I've not stayed at before. I had a nice king-size room with an actual bath as well as a separate shower. I relaxed and settled in. I decided to order some room service for my meal, and then I played some Starfield, which had just come out. I had some onion soup, which was so-so, but came with a half croque monsieur, which was pretty nice. And for my main course, I had a grand burger, which was pretty tasty. Beef, cheese, bacon, lettuce, tomato, and some nice chunky chips. I washed it all down with a can of Scuttlebutt Brewing Beer Amber Ale, which was pretty good. I watched some episodes of Naked and Afraid, a survival show where the gimmick is the contestants are naked. It was terrible. When it came time to shut the curtains, I was initially perplexed as to how they worked, as there seemed to be no string or chain to operate them. I eventually found a switch by the bed that triggered them up and down automatically. Very fancy. I played some more Starfield, which so far seems pretty good. I can see the oxygen sprint mechanic getting annoying, but the rest of it seemed pretty fun so far. Day 1. I slept pretty good. There was a weird water noise in the wall, which I thought was maybe rain running down a drain pipe, but it was still there in the morning and it wasn't raining, so perhaps the building is flooding inside the walls. I got washed and dressed, grabbed some coffee, and then headed out for the keynote/story time, which this year was the legendary ex-president of Nintendo America, Reggie Fils-Aimé. I headed over to the conference center and there was some initial confusion with working out where the new building was. It's across the street from the Paramount Theatre, which has been the main theatre a few times. It's a fairly large building, but it gets most of its area from height, going up 5 stories and then down another 1. The main expo floor is in the basement, and then the theatres and other stuff are on the other 5 floors, with the main theatre on the top level. It's a lot of stairs, and it's a pretty good view. It even has these sort of little nooks that stick out of the building on the sort of corners, so you can sort of see down the side of it. There was even a small rooftop garden overlooking the Paramount on floor 2, where the bar is. This building is now called the Summit, which has sort of 90% of the show, with the old area now named Arch having the rest of the expo floor, as well as a separate Nintendo Live event, which I didn't get tickets for. I think they were raffled off and I didn't know to apply. Getting into the building was pretty quick. They used the same walk-through scanners that I'd seen at PAX East, which is pretty efficient. You just walk through with your bags, and it's pretty quick and painless. The queue was pretty full, although PAX Lions said it was about a third, maybe. The main theatre is fairly wide, with about 3 sections of chairs. I was on one end of the left of the second block of chairs and had a pretty good view. They kicked off with some sort of supercut highlight reel of all the best Reggie moments, and then he welcomed us all to PAX 2003. He corrected the year, but mentioned he was at the first PAX when it was a tiny fan event. He gave a talk about his life, career, and his recommendations on how to succeed in a life in business. He had a lot of fun pictures with him and legendary Nintendo people like Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata.
It was a rough area. Building itself was infested with mice and roaches. There was a stabbing in the building. There were gang fights. My brother and I were mugged the same year that this photo was taken. I was 4 years old, he was 6 years old. Yeah, it was a rough space.
He talked about how he was responsible for the modern-day versions of Panda Express restaurants, and then Ryan Hartman turned up to ask some questions from the interwebs. It ran a little long and crashed right into the Penny Arcade Q&A. During the panel, I tried to take some pictures and then video with my little monocular camera, and it locked up and refused to turn on afterwards. I put it down to the battery being flat, as it seemed to work okay when I charged it later. It was an interesting talk. The guy behind me said it was the worst keynote he'd ever heard, that it was quite polished and corporate, and he suggested Reggie had given that same speech 100 times to Nintendo employees. I don't know about that. It felt fine, not as personal or revelatory as some keynotes I've been to, but fine. It seemed a lot of it was to plug his book. The QA started right away with the triumphant return of Mike to PAX after a prolonged absence, with Chris Straub having been taking the role of Better Mike in the past couple of years. This time, questions were delivered from Metal Pig from Fred Myers. This was the usual sort of questions, some of them easy on white paper, some of them PAX related in blue, and then the deadly black questions for the hard, philosophical, or unhinged.
Hello, welcome to PAX West 2023. 2023, that's right. Now, did you enjoy your Reggie experience? Do you feel like you're ready to disrupt industries? Wherever you go. Did you see his 5-point plan? There was a very specific, the arrows went in one direction. I think super easy to follow. You can all handle it. You're going to do okay. I would like to reintroduce my best friend, Mike Verhullen. Oh, hey everybody. And as I say, did Reggie go a little long? Yes. Right? It was okay. It was okay. Mike had to go to the bathroom.
I'm so a little nervous.
So that worked out fine.
It's been a minute since I've been up here.
Absolutely. And we get paid the exact same amount.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter.
We're fine with it. Now, it should be said that this pig, so occasionally Laura from work creates like holographically complex mini games for us to endure. as we're answering the questions of the Q&A. But then she went to Fred Meyer and saw this pig. And I think that that's it. That's the whole thing. This pig is her son. That you did not see it backstage, but she was very ginger with it. That's all I'm gonna say.
White envelopes are normal questions?
Yes.
PAX West related questions?
This is my suspicion, is that the blue...
There was the suggestion that since PAX is now in the new building, and the old building could become the Gabier Motors go-kart track, Jerry suggested a blood pit, something they'd wanted before but didn't have the space for, as Blood Puddle is not that impressive. Mike talked about how good Skechers slip-ons are as dad shoes. Not sponsored, but should be. He also talked about his best dish for barbecue potluck, a pork chop with a pineapple ring and then brown sugar on it so it melts and caramelizes. Jerry's was bolognese. Jerry kept talking to his daughter, who was in the front row in cosplay of what looked like one of the Mario Princess characters. He talked about how he can't play on his PC because his daughters are using it to play The Last of Us Part 1 on Epic. They were asked about the possibility of having mascots for the show, but they mentioned that the unofficial mascots, the deeply disturbing hot dog fairy for PAX West, the lobster roll fairy, PAX East, the taco fairy for the late great PAX South, the Philly cheesesteak fairy for PAX Unplugged, and of course, the drop bear for PAX Oz. They were asked about the positive benefits the gaming community had done, and so talked about Child's Play and how it funded tech people for the hospitals, who basically are there to get the gear like games, VR, etc. that Child's Play pays for, set up and maintained, and show people how to use it and play games with the kids, as otherwise all that gear requires someone like a nurse to learn it and set it up, and they have, quite frankly, more important things to do. So they pay for these people for a year or so, and then often the hospital picks them up full time, seeing the benefit there, which is pretty awesome. Those were a lot of religious questions for Jerry, as well as a few questions about what if people use their names as a pejorative, which they didn't completely understand. After that, I headed around the show floor for a bit, and then off to the Power Wash Simulator panel, which had a few people from the marketing team at Future Lab and the publisher Square Enix Collective. They talked about how the game had come from an itch.io demo, which then led to them building the full game in early access, which just blew up, and how they refined the game with community feedback, in some cases redesigning earlier levels like the playground. Originally it was one big floor area. They broke it up for a more satisfying completion. They also changed the colours, given how many people liked the bright colours of the playground level. They talked about getting brand deals and how they got Square Enix's brand easy because of course they're the publisher, but then SpongeBob DLC, which was the newly announced Back to the Future and Warhammer packs are coming. They also used this question app to take submissions from the audience that worked pretty well, although it did lead to the horrific suggestion of teeth, which stun-locked one of the panelists for quite a while. When we left, we got some free Power Wash pins and stickers. I was a bit tired and hungry by this point, so headed back to the hotel via the shops, picking up something to eat on the way. I watched the Jackbox Party Packs panel. There was the usual craziness with a lot of disturbing content, lots of stuff about salmon. I watched a panel on remaking video game music scores. They did a bunch of Final Fantasy scores and an amazing polka version of the Skyrim theme. Next up was a live game dev panel, where they made a game in a panel with art, code, music and sound effects all done in an hour. They took audience suggestions, and so the main character was a giraffe waifu rocket launcher, the enemies were pickle jars, the environment was a jungle trash dump kitchen, the game was called Giraffe Snafu Husbando Commandos, which was a vertical shooter akin to Galaga, with a soundtrack incorporating throat singing. It was delightful chaos. Finally, I watched a panel called the PAX Panel Show, which had a bunch of people from GameSpot and Giant Bomb. They had to fill in the blanks in a video game dialogue and answer questions on real-world occupations which some of their favourite games were based, then work out which character would work in which order in Rock, Paper, Scissors, featuring characters like Doom Guy, Isabelle from Animal Crossing, and Princess Zelda. I was feeling a bit tired after that and took a nap before doing some work on photos and such. Day 2. Before showering and dressing, and then heading over to the convention centre about 11 for my first panel at 11:30. It was a lot busier today. Saturday is usually the busiest day for obvious reasons. The improved security meant that it wasn't much of a wait to get in, just a very short queue. Headed up to the main theatre on floor 5, and it was straight in, having gotten there only a short time before kickoff. This was the Maker Strip panel, and it started with an offer that if the audience raised more than $2,000 for Child's Play, they would draw the unofficial official mascot, the Hot Dog Fairy, in the panel. And if we didn't make that goal, they would then kill the mascot. And Mike drew guns to illustrate that he was fully prepared to do it. I tried my little monocular camera again, and it died on me, so I think something has gone wrong there. It seemed to take pictures okay last time I used it, but the moment I hit video, it just died. If I can only use it in picture mode, it's not too much of a problem, but it is still a bit of an annoyance. As it turned out, the goal for $2,000 was smashed within seconds, so they had to move the goalposts, or put in a request on Craigslist for someone to come and help them move some heavy goalposts. Jay was a little reluctant to do this, but Mike pointed out that this was for charity, so it was fine. They then set the new goal at the end of the donation bar, which was $5,000 at its cap. This also didn't take long, as then donations just went off the end of the bar, and someone notably donated just enough to make the total $69. When asked how they achieved such sorcery, they replied, "It's called a calculator." So Jerry moved the goalpost a second time up to $7,000, offering to have one of the other mascots killed if the panel made that goal. We of course did, so they moved the goalpost a third time to $10K, and even had someone update the bar so the maximum value was now $10K. The goal was reached a little before the end of the panel and even surpassed slightly. Mike had already started drawing the dead Taco Fairy in a strip, assuming we would get there. Since PAX South is gone, though not forgotten, it makes sense to take the Taco Fairy out back and put them out of their misery. While Mike drew the strip, Jerry answered questions. There are at least 3 Pride and Prejudice themed ones from a Mr. William Collins, and then from Mr. Darcy's brother. All of them had Jerry overjoyed. There was more confirmation that PAX West, aka PAX Prime, is the best show, and none of the other shows will know if we call it that. There was a question that was basically just the lyrics of "I've Got a Brand New Combine Harvester" by the Wurzels, which Jerry didn't understand, but I'm not sure the Wurzels broke the American market. They were asked about gambling and talked about how over in Melbourne there is a casino right outside the convention centre, with mostly $20 tables, which is a bit steep for them, so they found a $5 table right near where they toss out the used husks of people when they've extracted all the money. Apparently Mike was really good at blackjack and had a really good run where he just couldn't seem to lose, and all the other people at the table were betting on his hand, and he came away with something like $500. Jerry said he gets too excited and then things go south. It was a fun panel. The comic was a callback to the Blood Pit, with Gabe asking Tycho if the show had been okay without him.
This is like when a reticulated python eats an antelope.
Yeah, I was done.
And then just digests. The body stops. The mind travels.
I never used it again. Like I didn't gain any weight. It did nothing for me.
except for one traumatic coma. Gather and throng, PAX West 2023. It has been our pleasure.
After that, I had a bit of time to kill, so I wandered the show floor and summit and found my way over to the show floor at Arch, which required some finagling to work out where the new entrance was, as instead of the front door, you went in via the tunnel under the side where the old will call tickets were. I wandered the floors, and I saw the Playdate, that little handheld gaming device with the crank which everyone got excited about a while back. Seems like they may be shipping the thing now. I've seen a few reviews out there, including one on Brutal Moose's channel, which seems somewhat favourable. There are a few CRPGs like Road Traeger, which is set in the 40k universe, and Thermitage, which look cool. There are also news about Vampire Bloodlines 2 is back and going again, but this is time with an all-new developer, so the game may actually be a thing now. There was also a huge Larian Studios booth. With the success of Baldur's Gate 3, they were riding high. Over at the other floor, there was Square Enix stuff like Power Wash Simulator's new Back to the Future DLC. Devolver had a big booth with games like Wizard with a Shotgun and Pepper Grinder. I saw a few indies. One was a zombie killing game with a sort of rolling vehicle, which I forget the name of, but it looked quite fun. I wandered for a bit and then headed over to the Q Hall for the NoClip panel. It was pretty busy, with the room being almost full. NoClip makes some really good documentaries on games and gaming, and they're Patreon funded, so they do pretty good work. It started off with their main presenter, Danny O'Dwyer, saying that he'd barely had any sleep because he had to get up at 3 AM to catch a flight from Oakland over to Seattle for this panel, which he was glad he was at since the place was absolutely full. They started off talking about their video recovery project, where they've been digitizing old E3 conference videos off of VHS. They like to record for historical sake those conferences and various presentations and trailers there. In doing that, they also found a lot of other weird stuff, like a Xena Warrior Princess fan club exclusive video, the talk from Lucy Lawless, thanking the fans for their support in season 1 of that show, and then a bunch of bloopers from it. After that, we saw a section of a 2000-era Konami press conferences with a comedian warm-up act, which was absolutely awful. They showed a few clips from their upcoming documentaries, one about the Burger King games, which were produced as a promotion back in the day. They apparently made 3 of these games, Big Bumping, Pocket Bike, and Sneak King, all for Xbox 360 and Xbox. The Sneak King is regarded as the best of the bunch. There was this guy called Leroy Patterson, a professional wrestler, reality TV star, and video editor, who decided for some reason to collect the game and now has thousands of copies of it. They talked about how they'd looked into the game to find out who made it and discovered it was made by a company run by the Olivet twins of Dizzy fame, something I think a very few people in the panel knew about, Dizzy also not having broken the record market. They also said a lot of people that were involved in it didn't really want to talk about it, as it's their most successful game and most well known, but not really that impressive in terms of commercial and critical success. They then showed a clip from the documentary that they hadn't got permission to show, a brave move since the panel was being live streamed on Twitch, and it turned out to be a Monkey Island documentary, which looked pretty cool. Of course that's Disney, so maybe lawyers will have it all shut down. They went through some of the suggestions they'd gotten from people in the audience for new documentaries like 50 Cent, Blood in the Sand, Rain World, Little Gator, and a bunch of others. They also got a suggestion for a Cyberpunk 2077 documentary, and the global marketing manager for CD Projekt Red was in the back of the room. Maybe he suggested it. He seemed keen to do it, so maybe that will come up. They took questions, one of which was how should a developer record themselves to document a project. They said to just record often and in short amounts, and record all the assets at various stages. You can always record yourself talking about it later, but you need that footage. It was a really fun panel, lots of interesting content coming from them, and generally just a good time. I went out and I immediately joined the queue for the next panel, which was in the same room, which was Retronauts present Baseball 2000 inside the original FPS. I had intended to go to see the Chris Stroud panel. Do not leave Chris Stroud panel titled blank this time, but it overlapped with a later panel I wanted to see, so I decided to see this one instead. It was actually a fairly interesting panel about a Game Boy game called Baseball 2000, which was a very, very early FPS. It predated Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. It had a very similar style to Doom and Wolfenstein, and it was running on Game Boy hardware, the computational equivalent of a shoe, and it had 3D gameplay as well as multiplayer using a link cable. This worked on the Nintendo 4-player link, but theoretically would go up to 16 players. I say theoretically as they never tested it, as it was a small dev team who only managed 10 Game Boys. Also, 4-player is as much as they ever built a link cable for. The panel, which was hosted by Jeremy Parish, co-host of Retronauts, talked about how the early 3D multiplayer games that ran on a system called the Plato in the 1970s, and largely lost to time since that machine was basically an academic and military system, not a commercial one. Those early experiments led to things like hard driving Stargazer on the Atari ST and others, and inspired the creation of a game called MIDI Maze by Xanth Software Effects, which had the same early 3D and used MIDI cables to do the network connectivity on early PCs. This led to the company Bulletproof Software, who were responsible for Tetris, to ask for a Game Boy port of the MIDI Maze, which became Baseball 2000. And was programmed by Robert Champagne, who was at the panel. He implemented the 3D functionality of the gameplay of Mini Maze on the Game Boy, and then later added the link cable multiplayer. and figuring out how it worked as a daisy-chain bus, decided to see how far he could push it, and suggested it would support up to 16 machines, although it was never tested. He also worked on a SNES port of the game, and there was a port for Game Gear which he advised on. Years later, the information that it would run potentially up to 16 players came up, and people tried and failed to get it to work. And this interested engineer, Alexander Barr, to see if he could get it working. He'd worked on a mod that could accept the serial connection and emulate the Game Boy printer onto an SD card, so he had some idea of how the system worked. He tried to contact Robert, but had no luck, so he did his best to design a system that would connect 16 Game Boys together. And he may have succeeded. He had a prototype there on stage, and they planned to take it and try it with 16 Game Boys and 16 copies of Faceball 2000 to see if it would work. I didn't go along as I had another panel which was live on YouTube with film joy and folding ideas. Waiting in line was pretty warm. The new convention centre is essentially a big glass box, which seems to be like a greenhouse when the sun hits it. It's not too bad in the rooms or down on the show floor, but near those windows the heat really seems to get directed and it overwhelms the aircon. Film joy is run by Mikey Newman, who at one point worked for Gearbox and is the voice of Scooter, but moved on to do his own thing, FilmJoy full-time, examining films in a very extensive and personal way. Folding Ideas is Dan Olsen, responsible for some amazing documentaries. His The Line Goes Up was a scathing examination of NFTs, and his further other work is pretty good, so I was really looking forward to the two of them talking. They started with a pop quiz hotshot, where they quizzed each other with some really stupid questions about film, one of which had the answer Jarhead 4, and another of which was which live-action remake of a Disney film did Jon Favreau direct in recent years? Trick question, there are several. This also revealed that there are multiple live-action remakes of Jungle Book, which I had forgotten. They then went on to serious questions about the things they did. Mikey discussed being earnest and authentic in his things. Dan mentioned when he first saw Mikey's stuff, he couldn't watch it because it made him so professionally envious he couldn't stand it. They talked about how Dan's excellent In Search for Flat Earth, where he did an experiment that showed the curvature of the Earth, and then made the point that it didn't matter as the people in it are not really looking to be disproved, and indeed are going deeper down and more disturbing rabbit holes than Flat Earth. Dan talked about how great the Borderland intro cinematics were, which Mikey was responsible for. Mikey mentioned that in Borderlands 1, where Lilith comes strutting down the bus, that's him. Also, the guy who leaps off the train in Borderlands 2 is also him. He broke a rib. It was great to see these two amazing creators in the same room bouncing off each other. It was really funny and entertaining. After that, it was coming up for 6:30, and I was hungry. I hadn't eaten all day, so I headed back to the hotel. I ordered some room service, corn chowder soup, and chicken tenders with a Rogers Pilsner to wash it down. The soup came with an adorably small bottle of Tabasco, which when I found it hiding under the salt shaker, I emptied into the soup, which made it much better. It was a good chunky soup with corn and nice chunks of potato, and the Tabasco really gave it a nice kick. The chicken tenders were really good, a nice crunchy batter and delicious chicken inside, with a honey mustard dip and some chunky fries. The beer was pretty good, a nice crisp Pilsner. I ate my food, drank my beer, while watching the sunset over the buildings in the bay, which was pretty good into the day, although the fun wasn't quite over yet. I wrote up some of my day, and then I watched Acquisitions Incorporated. This was the first time Mike was back as Jim Darkmagic. It was a pretty fun story. The cast this time were Anna Prosser as Evelyn Marthane, Jasmine Bula as Certainty Dran, Jeremy Crawford as Vi, Jerry Hawkins as Owen Dran, and Mike Krahulik as Jim Darkmagic. Chris Perkins was the DM, and absent but represented in the game was Xavier Woods as Bobby Zaworowski. The main thrust of the story this time was trying to recruit this alternate world Jim Darkmagic to their team, which they did by convincing him it was sort of TV show that was being broadcast. So a lot of the time Jim was playing to an imagined crowd. There was a lot of fun stuff with them going into a mine and a riddle. They had some great miniatures as well, a whole diorama setup that they built with lots of LEDs and 3D printing by the looks of it. There was a lot of fun stuff with these goblins and a wicker owlbear, which was made by Holly Conrad. And they all joined Jim in smoking with the goblins, which turned out to be something rather unpleasant. It was a fun time, and it was another great episode of Hacking. Jerry wrapped it up with a spoken word rap thing with all the people in the group. It was pretty epic. Day 3. I got up around 9:30, had a coffee and looked out at the day. It was a bit grey. I got myself together and got ready to go, headed up to the conference centre at around 11. It was a little quieter today, still probably busier than Friday, but noticeably less people were about. I headed up to the main theatre on the 5th floor for the first panel of the day, Seattle by Night, which was a Vampire the Masquerade live roleplay session. They kicked off with the trailer for the revamped, pun intended, Vampire Bloodlines 2, which developer Chinese Room had taken over from the previous developer, Hardsuit Labs. This new version is not due out till 2024, and I think Bloodlines 2 was originally supposed to come out in 2021, but then they fired everyone. I would love to see another game like Vampire Bloodlines, with a more modern, less buggy release, but it does seem to be a cursed franchise. The storyteller, or GM, for this game was Jason Carl. The cast was Jerry Holkins as Jameson Keene, Mike Krahulik as Tom Hollandaise, Jasmine Bula as Betty Lancaster, and Luis Cazaro as Enrique Rico Suarez. The story revolved around the gang setting themselves up in Seattle, trying to make connections and move up from their positions in Tacoma. They met at the gun wall near Pike Place, had a bit of a fight with another vampire with vampire coyote familiars, then went to a vampire bar to see if they could make a contact in the powers of Seattle. It was a pretty fun adventure. I really enjoyed the previous Seattle by Night stories, and to see more of them is fun. Vampire always seems to be a bit more brutal than D&D. The system lends itself even better to disastrous failure. In this game they had 2 bestial failures, one when Tom nearly lost his hand and took wisdom damage for the rest of the game, and one was only averted by taking a hunger reroll. Next I went to a panel called Putting the Sci Back in Sci-Fi, Metroid Edition. Had a bunch of PhD and master's degree students who went through the science behind Metroid, which is not really a lot. They kicked off by talking about vaccines, which is used in the game to inoculate Samus against the X virus with a vaccine made from the last baby Metroid, which also turned her blue and made her vulnerable to frost. This wasn't really how vaccines work. They usually take some part of an organism itself rather than something from a third party, so they surmised this was actually gene editing and not a vaccine, and used something akin to CRISPR. The next person talked about how some of the weapons worked. Charge beam, bunch of capacitors to release a burst of X-rays. How does it make a ball? Don't know. Plasma beam. Plasma is a real thing, it's very hot. Ice beam, a super soaker full of liquid hydrogen or helium. It would freeze stuff, although it wouldn't really unfreeze afterwards and still be alive, and you wouldn't be able to jump on it. Plasma grapple, just a rope painted to look like plasma or maybe magnets. Missiles, they're cool and they work, why not just use them all the time? How is it powered? Don't know, maybe microreactors. The next person talked about the pools of acid in the game. Also lava, which is apparently just the same as acid but a different colour. I never did chemistry, so I'll take their word for it. These pools dissolve Samus's suit until she gets an upgrade and then she's fine. So what acid is like that, very corrosive but also can be contained? The acids he went through were super acids, and the entries for all 3 in Wikipedia all list them as the strongest acids in existence. One of them, HEH, just melted through everything and couldn't be made in large quantities or really contained in anything. One of the others could be made, but couldn't dissolve a lot of things. The third was very corrosive, and there was stuff like Teflon that could contain it. Next they discussed how to take out the X-parasite/virus. They did this with climate change. Destroy the plants, overheat the environment, it just kills everything. Next was the problem of interstellar distances and communication, in that the distances involved in the games are so large it would take tens of thousands of years for a terrestrial to arrive, and then the same to then get there, assuming you could move at the speed of light. Finally, we had the problem of AI with Mother Brain and Adam. The presenter talked a lot about the problems of ethics and using datasets, and the problems of hallucinations of AI and how a lot of the datasets available are not even real data, they are simulated. This whole field is pretty new, and a lot of the things are quite relevant to what's happening today with AI. They then took questions about Metroid weird science. It was a fun panel with some real science in amongst the fun. The next panel was Games You Can't Play with Rim DaCosta and Scott Rubin from the podcast Geek Nights. They talked about rating games on the extinction scale used for animals. This immediately causes problems, as in games there are at least two kinds of extinction. Games you can't play anymore because they're gone for some reason, and games you don't want to play anymore. They discussed the most robust and survivable games like board games. Most of them, so long as someone knows the rules, are easy to replicate. With PC games, things like Doom and Quake, which actually got a patch recently, are fairly robust because they're still updated and all of the source is open. Plus they don't require any networking, and in Doom's case will run on almost anything more sophisticated than Toaster. Multiplayer games are less so due to needing server architecture. Also, physical games where they're no longer possible due to societal issues like cops harassing adults in playgrounds, example of Vampire Tag, or things like some variants of D&D or more weird and wonderful RPGs, where it's almost impossible to find enough people to play. Technologies like Battlezone pods or the early VR virtuality machines, things where there are very few machines left, and they require some quite specialist knowledge to maintain them, even if you were able to play them. Online games like Fortnite or games like Tribes 2, where the online got buggered by their devs. One of the hosts talked about trying to play Tribes 2. There were very, very few fan servers, almost completely full of bots, and a handful of people trying to play some of the obscure mod versions of the game. He logged into a fan Discord to try and get Tribes 2 running, and then saw a section called Politics with an alt-right shitbag in there. He left immediately. Certain versions of things like Counter-Strike survived, but not all, due to how the community viewed certain changes in certain versions. A lot of online games are like that, where there might be hundreds of versions that just aren't available. I remember back in the day with Star Wars Galaxies, where they kept retooling the systems, making it more and more different to try and balance the Jedi part of it. Eventually everyone was a Jedi from the start, and then they completely redone all the systems, maybe 3 or 4 times. They ended with a sort of call to arms to be a person that maintains a game, or even just makes people aware of games you love. So many games and things become extinct simply because no one knows they exist, and so no one saves them. I had a bit of a gap, so I wandered the show floor, and then up to the tabletop area and wandered that. I ate a mediocre Cubano sandwich, which was really just ham and cheese with a pickle in it and toasted. Not really any mustard or pork. It was fine. I washed it down with a lemon and blackberry fizzy flavoured water. I also wandered out onto the rooftop garden on the 3rd floor where the Voodoo Ranger beer garden was. It just started to rain, so I took a brief look before sitting back inside. Maybe I'll visit again tomorrow. Refueled, I headed over to my next panel, Playing Pretend in Roleplay in Games, which was hosted by Kate Welch and included Anna Proster, Thomas Middleditch, Grigori Paratan, and a guy called Logan or Tank. I think they were not listed in the schedule, so maybe they were a late addition. They talked a lot about role-playing, both in the live D&D or other systems, as well as roleplay servers for games like Red Dead Redemption Online or GTA Online. About the importance of story and the ways that various characters both were part of them and then not. How in some of the live RPG settings that line becomes more difficult to manage or causes people to try and second guess them about what their characters would and wouldn't do. They mentioned these games creating very strong bonds, strong friendships with people they played with. And they mentioned not doing things just for a stream or for yourself, coming back to a key of collaboration and stories. They mentioned the often cathartic nature of being able to play out things in roleplay that you maybe can't do in real life. It was a pretty good panel. After that, I went to Acquisitions Inc. The Series 2 exclusive sneak preview. The panel was Ryan Hartman and Laura From Work Stringer, who talked about the Kickstarter. At least at first they talked about Lithuanian sports people for some reason. Then they talked about Kickstarter. Then we got to see the first episode of Series 2. Pretty good and led on from the live D&D session the other night. They had obviously filmed the series before the live show, and so there were a few slight inconsistencies, but it was a pretty good continuation. Finally, I went to the Secret Club PA panel. This year we had Mike and Jerry taking questions, but joining them was Jerry's daughter, Ronia. It led to an interesting dynamic. Also, the whole front row were in Jerry cosplay with black t-shirt and bald cap. This included his wife and presumably other friends and family. It was a great panel and fun end to the day. I headed back to my hotel to crash, write things up, save my photos, and so on. I managed to pack a full day in this time, and it wore me out quite a bit. I was lucky that I found enough overlapping things I wanted to see to keep up until 9 PM when the secret panel started. Tomorrow's the last day of PAX West, so one more fun day to go. Day 4. Another grey day, and Labour Day, an American holiday about labour relations, I think. Anyway, last day of PAX, and often the shortest one in terms of available entertainment. In fact, there wasn't much in terms of panels early in the day. The first thing I was interested in wasn't until 1 PM. So we decided to have a bit of a lie-in, then play a touch of Starfield, have some coffee, shower, dress, and then head over to the convention centre at a leisurely pace. When I was dressing, I realised I'd somehow not bought enough t-shirts. I had enough for PAX itself, but no clean t-shirts left for the trip home. I had packed enough underwear and even had a spare set, but for some reason had miscounted on t-shirts. I remember not packing a spare since I was space limited, but I thought I'd gotten enough for every day. Still, not a massive issue as there are t-shirts available at PAX. I headed up to the convention centre, and it was probably the quietest day, which makes sense as there's less stuff to do on the final day. It doesn't make much sense to come Monday if it's your only day. I did see some ticket resellers manage to sell a badge for Monday to someone, and they sold it for about $60 or so. I think this is actually less than retail, so I'm not sure what they offered the person selling it, presumably less than that. The first panel was Why You Were Wrong About Street Fighter Movie, hosted by Erica and Sarah Tomas. They did a panel of previous years about the original and still best 1993 Mario movie, why it is great, and according to convincing quotes they gave from various reputable sources, the people agree, with popularity rising all across the world. They now attempted to do the same treatment for a 1994 film based on Street Fighter. Here, rather than just let the film people do whatever they liked, as in the Mario film, Capcom took full control and funded most of the $35 million budget themselves. Their first requirement was the leading man had to be Jean-Claude Van Damme, the muscle from Brussels, and he took $8 million out of that budget and promptly turned it into copious amounts of coke and inhaled it on set. They also secured the legendary, the incomparable Raul Julia for the role of M. Bison. Of course, what they didn't know was that he was suffering from stomach cancer and in pretty poor health. When he arrived to start shooting, they were shocked at how bad he looked, and rearranged the schedule to try and give him time to rest and recover. This led to them shooting the action first, which threw off their stunts and martial arts planning, such that often the actors were given little or no time to learn their stunts or prepare, which with the best will in the world didn't make for the most compelling fight choreography. They had secured Stephen E. D'Souza to direct the film. He had a reasonably good track record as an action film writer. He wrote Die Hard, 48 Hours, Commando, and The Tomb Raider Cradle of Filth. But he did also write Flintstone, Hudson Hawk, and the Stallone Judge Dredd, so a few misses among those hits. He doesn't really have many credits as a director, and maybe this film is one of the reasons why. Initially, there were only going to be a few characters from the game, but then Capcom added 2 more, then another 2, then another 2, and so on until basically all the characters were in the film. They had to fit that into their story. They also wanted the film out for Christmas to match with the toy line that they had going with Hasbro. They had to recut the finished film 3 times. The first time because the rating was mature and that doesn't sell kids toys, and then it came back as G, which isn't edgy enough for those teen boys that they wanted to capture. So they added 1 swear to bump it up to a PG-13 rating. They shot the film in Bangkok, which also proved to be an issue. The sets were falling apart, and they blew out the local power grid with all their equipment. Also, all the actors were going off and spending all their money in the local entertainment industries and getting wasted and worse every night. So it was a bit of a shit show, and it got absolutely panned by critics and audiences alike. This was where they started making their argument for why it's good. They actually managed to keep pretty close to the source material, adapting it here and there, but following things pretty well, and even had some good arcs and convincing plot lines for the various characters, even with such a massive cast. They also managed to work in almost all the characters in their in-game outfits without making it too ridiculous. And of course, one of the main reasons was Mr. Raul Julia. He goes all out and takes it very seriously with an incredible performance as the unhinged dictator warlord. He has many iconic villain lines, and he delivers them all out with his signature style and skill. His performance alone is probably enough of a reason to watch that film. So they concluded, it's a great film to watch, assuming you knew what you were going to get going in. I've only seen it once, and I think not all the way through, so I'll have to track it down again and watch it. They then announced they had a podcast, which I might have to check out. The panel ended slightly early, so I headed down to the show floor to see what was left in the merch booth. I hadn't picked up anything so far, as I was travelling light, and also I saw you could order almost all the stuff off their website. But now I was in need, so I headed over there, and there were no queues, which was nice. In terms of remaining stock, there wasn't much left. I got a PAX West black t-shirt with the logo in blue, so I'm set for the journey home. I had some time to kill, so I wandered the floor, picked up a bit of lunch, a mediocre mini pizza and a Sprite, then I had a look around for games I could try. I managed to try 3 different games. The first was called Stellar Watch, which was sort of tower defense wave shooter where you had a spaceship and you were defending it, and you could sort of set up turrets of various types in spots around the ship, and then you moved the ship to intercept incoming enemies, bringing those turrets to bear. It came on sort of various paths. The key seemed to be lining up as many of them as possible on the path so you get as much damage. It was a pretty good game. The second I played was called Eventualist Duality, which was a bit of an odd one. Cyberpunk neon worlds in a 3D front-on view with hand-drawn 2D sprites of all the people. Sort of a 2.5D-ish thing. Seemed to be some sort of narrative story game with QTE-type fighting. I found some of the art a bit ugly, and I didn't quite understand the action for a long time. It flashed icons over certain characters to do QuickTime events, and I missed them a lot. I didn't have a lot of context for what was going on either. Then the screen went back and the game crashed, so I moved on. The final game I played was called Thermitage, and it was a CRPG with a turn-based combat system about demon summons and magic. I played the demo and it was pretty good. It seemed to have a lot of depth on what you could do with it, having an action with your demon familiar also having an action. On top of that, there was this sort of clue-gathering exploration mechanic where I was tracking down someone possessed by a demon, and then had to sort of draw the demon out to fight it and free the person. It looked pretty good. I enjoyed playing it. I'll have to check it out when it comes out later this year. The next panel was voice acting for video games, free 2023 DLC. There were supposed to be 2 voice actors from Destiny 2 there, but they seem not to have been able to come. I got to the panel late as I was finishing up the demo of Thermitage. Still, it was an interesting panel on how to get into the voice acting industry and the sort of things you need. After it was over, it was time for the final event, the Megathon Final Round.
West 2023. Now, are you exhausted by the levels of the last 4 days, or do you have one more event in you?
No, just go home. It's over, right?
No! Chris, god damn it! Now listen,
This year the game was Black Emperor, a really interesting looking arcade game where you used a slidey wheel and a button to control a motorbike. You had to get as far as you could without hitting anything or going off screen. You would try and stay on the road moving around, sometimes braking or having barriers or some such going sort of left to right. And then if you got to sand outside the road, it would drag you backwards towards the edge of the screen. A simple game, but a very compelling one. It had an awesome soundtrack. Apparently the machine blew air in your face to simulate the rush of blasting on the highway. It looked like a blast to play. The Omeganauts got 10 goes and then their best score was kept. The one with the best score at the end of the 10 runs won. In this case it was Centipede, won the contender of a No Panic Disco. They won a ticket to the PAX of their choosing. At one point this was a ticket and all the trimmings like hotel and such, but I guess not. They reported the Child's Play number, which was $81,000, which is pretty amazing. $10,000 alone for the mega strip. Mike is now not allowed to not come to PAX. It's too costly for Child's Play if he skips one. They thanked the enforcers, the exhibitors, and everyone else, and PAX was over.
thanks so much for playing all of the games. Let's put the final parenthesis on here. First and foremost, it is absolutely vital that we recognize and thank the enforcers who are the spine of the show. feel as well. Second, if I could please have a round of applause for all of our guests from the exhibitor halls, guests on the stage, everybody up here, all the stuff that we have enjoyed, the incredible feast. Yes. And finally, thank you so much to everyone inside and outside of this room that brings the spirit of PAX with them to the show every time they come. It has been our great pleasure to host you. We'll see you next year.
Headed back to my hotel room to recover, get some dinner, and pack for my flight tomorrow, which is 11:20, so I'll probably need to get up pretty early to head over to the airport. All in all, it's been a pretty fun PAX. I've enjoyed it, and the new convention centre does make it a bit more contained than it has been in previous years, where you had to do a lot of going back and forth between different hotels just for all the different places that they'd set up panels. It's still not quite all in one place, which is a little bit of a disappointment, but still, it's a lot better than it was. Next day, I got up pretty early to catch the light rail over to the airport at about 8 a.m. I got to the airport and went through security. There they did make me remove all my stuff, and I forgot some of it, and then I had to go through again. But after that, I was out to the gate. The seating area was incredibly busy. I guess a lot of people coming back from their short breaks. There was almost nowhere to sit directly near the gate. But it wasn't too bad. The plane ride was okay. I was in an aisle seat in the emergency exit row, so I had a bit more room, and I got to board a bit earlier. I got an Uber from the airport back home, and that was that. PAX once again finished. It was a great trip. I really enjoyed some of the panels, and the environment was pretty good. The new convention center was great. Weather was pretty good. It was a fun trip, and I look forward to doing it again.